examines the current international economic system in this book, The Commanding Heights, the battle between government and the marketplace that is remaking the modern world. The paperback edition of the book was just published last month and has been updated to include the international economy over the last year. He spoke at Barnes & Noble Booksellers in Bethesda, Maryland.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out on this cold and windy night. We are honored to have Pulitzer Prize winning author Dr. Daniel Yergin with us here this evening. He earned his Pulitzer from his book titled The Prize, The Epic Quest for Oil, Money, and Power, which was published originally in 1991. And Dr. Yergin is the chairman of Cambridge Energy Research Associates here in the Washington, D.C. area. And tonight we are here to listen to Dr. Yergin discuss the book he has recently co-authored, The Commanding Heights. And as Jeffrey Garten of the New York Times Book Review stated, this book is a brilliantly successful project, a colorful and even suspenseful story of how the world has been transformed over the last half-century. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Daniel Yergin. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you. Is the sound okay? Good. Well, thank you for coming here this evening and a chance to talk a little bit about our book, The Commanding Heights, the battle between government and marketplace that's remaking the modern world. And I wanted to share some of the themes and thinking that went into it and then look forward to opening it up to discussion with you all. It is a remarkable time in world history, actually, because it's the first time we've had a real global economy since the beginning of this century, and it's almost as though the end and the beginning of the century have been conjoined. At the beginning of the century, it was a very optimistic time. Technology was shrinking the world. Trade and investment was expanding, and you had emerging markets, of which the United States was the leading version. All of that, of course, ended in 1914 with the Guns of August and the outbreak of the First World War. And it wasn't, in fact, until the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of communism that you had this kind of coming together again of a world economy. The term that's been used, and we'll critique a little bit, is globalization. It's almost the poster word for the post-communist world. But one of the questions I want to kind of discuss with you all tonight is what comes after it. But these changes have been brought about by a vast change in the mind of the world and really in ideas of what people think about a changing balance of the confidence between governments and markets. It's been brought about by this integration of economies, by technologies, and I think by a fourth factor that has really become very powerful, which is in fact the shareholder, the effect of the combined retirement savings of the industrial world, which have such a big voice on what happens to companies of all kinds. Well, these are the kind of changes I want to talk about and focus a little bit on the change in thinking. And these changes are really very large. We've had a process of privatization, of selling off state assets around the world that's measured in trillions of dollars. In this country, we've had in so many different parts of our economy deregulation. Around the world, socialists now promote capitalism. It's a decade almost since Margaret Thatcher fell from power in England, and a Thatcherite is now Prime Minister of Britain. He just happens to be head of the British Labour Party. Two examples of the change of mind closer to home. One is in the Commanding Heights, we quote Larry Summers, who's the Deputy Treasury Secretary in the Clinton administration. And Larry, who's the nephew of two Nobel Prize winners in economics, as well as a very powerful economist himself, and of course a very influential policymaker, told me when we were interviewing him for the book, he said that when he was growing up, the famous free market economist Milton Friedman was the devil incarnate of his youth. And he said with the passage of time, he's had increasingly grudging respect for him, and then Larry paused and said increasingly ungrudging respect. And I think that captures some of this change of mind that we talk about in this book. But another example that's right in the news today, something that is really unthinkable, is that both Democrats and Republicans are talking about privatizing part of Social Security, which even 2 or 3 years ago was an almost unthinkable subject, which shows the kind of changes. And what a change it's been. Imagine for a moment, let's go back in time to 1938, and imagine you're in the Place de la Concorde subway in Paris, and an elderly American collapses and passes away. And the news that he had only a few cents, only a few centimes in his pocket, becomes headline news around the world. And it's because this man was named Samuel Insull. And he's one of the most interesting characters we write about in The Commanding Heights. Because in the 1920s, he was the epitome of American capitalism. People sort of fell upon every word he said. And he created a great electric power utility, not a monopoly, but a great holding company. But in the Depression, he ran into what's called an earnings disappointment, which means the shares in the company fell from $100 a share to $1 a share. And Franklin Roosevelt was running for president and said, we're going to get the Insulls, and Insull got the message and fled the country, sailed around the Mediterranean on a boat, eventually was brought back to the United States, stood trial, was acquitted, became an exile in Paris, and ended up in the Paris subway. And he and people like him were the symbols of what had gone wrong, what was wrong with American capitalism. And it was out of that we got our particular distinctive form of capitalism in the United States, which was a kind of regulatory capitalism with lots of regulatory agencies. In other parts of the world, they also had what became known as the mixed economy, but you had a great deal of state ownership of basic industries like coal and steel and so forth. Japan did it differently with what was called administrative guidance, which really meant that powerful government agencies would tell companies what to do, tell business people what to do. But all of this was based upon a notion that markets fail, that markets don't work very well, that they're wasteful, that they're inefficient, they go in the wrong direction. Famous economist in India said we can't have free choice in terms of investment because otherwise people would build lipstick factories. Not acceptable. And there was a need in so much of the world after World War II and in developing countries to mobilize resources and capital, scarce resources and capitals. And so the dominant mode really became this notion of a mixed economy. And one of the things that led us to write this book was I was a few years ago wandering through this market on the outskirts of Moscow called the Izmailova Market, which stretches for acres, where you can buy everything from Tsarist swords to little pins with Lenin's picture on them, Persian cats, carpets from the Caucasus, South Korean electronics. And I was walking with a friend who at that time was a British ambassador, and he said how much easier it would have been for the Russians if communism had collapsed in the 1970s. And I thought this was an interesting observation, and I said, why? And he said, because at that time people believed in the mixed economy, so they could have kind of taken down all the communist banners and just continued to have these very large, money-losing, state-owned enterprises. But that mindset disappeared, went away. Why? We had problems in our country in terms of stagflation and inflation and low economic growth. In many countries, state-owned companies, which had been the engines of modernization, came to be seen instead as the source of inefficiency, that they couldn't escape control of politics. A third reason was the fall of the Red Star. We have an unusual beginning for the chapter of Russia's movement from communism to the market and Poland's movement. It begins in 1960 with John F. Kennedy running for president saying, we must get this nation moving again. And I'd always wondered about that because it was a very famous image. Some of you will remember it. Some of you have seen it on film. But nation moving again in what? In a race. And what was the race? We were in a race against the Soviet economy. And it was thought that the Soviet economy was growing at 3 or 4 times what the American economy was. And it had great prestige and was a model people wanted to imitate, 5-year central planning. It only was in the 70s and 80s that people realized that actually it wasn't growing at all, that in fact it beyond a certain kind of level, it stalled. And so people stopped believing and looking towards that kind of model. There are 2 other things that were very significant in terms of changing the world's thinking. One was the debt crisis that enveloped Latin America in the 1980s, the lost decade, because that meant that you couldn't have governments running up huge deficits, running these state-owned companies and running these losses because they couldn't afford it. They'd go bankrupt. And so governments began selling off enterprises, sometimes quite controversial, but everything from factories to, in Argentina, the government owned the circus. The last thing that had a big impact on changing the mind, and it's going to sound ironic today, was the success of the East Asian economies. Today, people look at their problems, but they were much more market-oriented than other economies. South Korea and India had about the same per capita income in the 1960s. At the beginning of the 1990s, South Korea's per capita income was 15 times higher than India's. And so that had a big impact on people in India and many other countries saying, well, maybe you should be more market-oriented. So this is kind of the implementation, this is the kind of change of mind we talk about, but how did it come about? Well, we talk about the changes in the United States, both Reagan and the rise of the New Democrats. But I think that you have to say for the story that we're telling, and we try and tell it in The Commanding Heights as a narrative story built around people, the two revolutionaries, one is Margaret Thatcher, who didn't even want to use the word privatization when she became prime minister. For the first 3 years of her prime ministership, was the most unpopular prime minister in Britain since they started doing political polling. And then came the accident of the Falklands War, and she became became the Iron Lady, and started an economic program, much attacked, much criticized, but now the script for much of the world, and it's been embraced by the left as well as the right in a general sense. It's interesting, when I interviewed her, at the end of the interview, she stops at the top of the stairs and saying goodbye, and she says, you know, I want you to remember one thing. So I was prepared to remember one thing, and she said, beliefs. Always start with beliefs. And in a sense, you came away with recognizing how important and powerful ideas are in not their effect immediately, but over a period of 7 or 10 or 15 years. And I think that's one of the themes of the book. The other revolutionary was Deng Xiaoping in China, who had been a follower of Mao. He had risen with Mao 3 times. He had fallen for 3 times. He'd been put in solitary confinement. His son had been pushed out of a window and paralyzed. And Deng finally came to power just about the same time as Margaret Thatcher. And he said, I have 2 choices. I can distribute wealth or I can distribute poverty. And started this process of reform that people were quite skeptical about, but has brought China to where it is today, which is a mixture of a market economy and a state-controlled economy. And it was interesting, at the end of Deng's life, they brought out these stories to kind of dramatize the changes he'd made. And the one that I found particularly interesting, and we used in the book, is the story that when he went at the age of 16 to Paris, just after the First World War, to study, he became a communist. But he also opened, as they now revealed, a restaurant called the China Bean Curd Shop. And the stories were that he was a great success. In fact, he was so successful at it, they had to expand it and make it larger. And the moral of the story at the end of his life, which was a few years ago, was that you could be both a good communist and a good capitalist at the same time. And that, in a sense, is what China is struggling with today. Well, these changes have been very powerful, but we've entered this age of that goes beyond now globalization. It's an era we call globality, which is an idea of a highly interconnected world. It has 2 great symbols. One is more or less positive, the internet, and the other is very negative, which is a financial contagion that swept around the world. But we did ask the question, will there be a swing back from all of this? And we try and lay out 5 tests to watch in terms of whether the world will change its mind again. One is, do these new market systems deliver the goods in terms of higher standards of living and jobs and employment? The second is social equality, equity, fairness. do societies deliver that? And different societies will look at it differently, but that will be a fundamental question. A third question is what happens to national identity and cultural identity in a world in which the same images flood down from satellites all around the world. I think the fourth test is one about the environment and will people feel that environmental issues are met within market systems. And the fifth issue is demographics, which is both the young in the developing world and the elderly in the developed world. And you look at a country like Japan, which is maybe 10 years ahead of the United States. Within 10 years, over 25% of the Japanese population will be over 65. And as the industrial countries become more elderly, there will be demands made both on government, on state, and there will also be demands that will be made on markets which people's retirements are so tied up with. So that's kind of the perspective. But as we were revising the book, carrying it from hardcover to paperback, we got one question again and again, which is the pendulum swinging back? Have we moved from an era already in which markets at the forefront to an era in which governments are going to reassert their sway over economies? And we got that question from a lot of people, but we got it even more. We asked that question of ourselves even more. We asked it, I'd say, with a certain degree of urgency, because after all, the year in which the book had been out, a lot had happened, and a lot of it did not exactly, outside of North America, make a profoundly positive case for markets for millions, tens of millions, or hundreds of millions of people around the world. And that's why I think the importance of, in the book, we were talking not about the triumph of markets, but really about the testings and the trials that are ahead. And I think what the recent months have demonstrated is how formidable those testings can be. After all, during the period that we were revising the Commanding Heights, Asia sunk deeper to crisis, economic disorder turned into political upheaval, the emerging market crisis turned into global contagion. Contagion was another new word that we've learned over the last year, triggering the Russian collapse and almost beaching Brazil, and maybe still will. We don't know. That's playing out before our eyes. Japan's slump got so bad that it actually did something about its banking system. And as some of you may remember, by the time here in Washington last autumn, the World Bank and the IMF were having their annual meeting, this phrase, systemic failure, had become the euphemism for the feared global collapse, at least until the Federal Reserve came riding to the rescue, guns blazing, with 3 interest cuts in a row. And in the meantime, socialists of one kind or another have solidified their control over most of the European Union. Well, so there were a lot of notable changes in the world, and we made some important changes in doing this new edition. One was to deal more fully with the question of how this Asian economic miracle has been transliterated into crony capitalism, and maybe going from one extreme in which people were mesmerized by the high growth rates in Asia, which is why that speculative boom ended in collapse, to one where people want to forget the forces that made for its great success. In the new section, Global Contagion, we have to deal with this question. Is there going to be a world central bank or not? Or will it be more sort of a patchwork of kind of cures, which is more likely? It was very interesting to deal with the chapter on Russia. We called it the ticket to the market, which was a phrase from Boris Yeltsin. And we ended it rather optimistically with a 33-year-old vodka tycoon as the embodiment of Russia's more or less successful transition to capitalism. And this young man, Dovkin, was quite a remarkable guy. He introduced design. He decorated vodka bottles with photographs of himself in a tuxedo and his grandfather in tuxedo, because his grandfather had been a pre-revolutionary entrepreneur who, of course, his career was cut short. As I say, it was a more or less successful transition, and as we learned last August 17th, the less turned out to be much greater than the more. And so one of the changes in the book is indeed the vodka merchant is gone, and the chapter now ends with a man named Leszek Balcerowicz, who was Poland's once and present finance minister and the architect of that country's successful transition, ruminating on why this thing called shock therapy worked in Poland suddenly the market really functioned and failed in Russia. And I thought his quote was a very interesting one. He said, at the end of the 20th century, we know what are good economic policies and what are bad economic policies. Reform really means creating a better framework for decision-making, is the way he put it. And in Russia, what about reform? He said, reform was not given a chance. Now, the costs of this global contagion have been enormous, whether measured in money or, more sadly, in people's lives. Much second thought is now being given as to whether the push for financial liberalization was not only naive but wrong. And people ask that question again, do markets have a tendency to go to extremes? What kind of government action is needed to avoid future busts? Those are the questions that are being asked. And certainly there's much to reform and fix. And yet, so far, at least as we could tell in terms of our work on this book, there seems to be little to go back to, at least if one wants to continue to benefit from the participation in the world economy. And that, in good part, is embodied in this word we use called globality. Now, we did use the word in the first edition of the book, but we used it very sparingly, carefully, because we didn't want to be jargon merchants. But we were trying to express our dissatisfaction with this word globalization. The word is everywhere. Just last week, President Clinton, in his foreign policy speech in San Francisco, proclaimed the inexorable logic of globalization. In fact, he liked the phrase so much, he proclaimed it twice. But we found that word globalization too limited, too tied to specific strategies, too suggestive of a process. We want to know what happens after that. What will this interconnected world look like, this 24-hour, hyperactive, interconnected, email-fueled world in which, instead of sleeping, people are doing their emails, in which work is networked across borders, borders become less significant. And increasingly, this globality is already here, as I said before, whether you talk about internet or you talk about financial contagion. Now, it was very interesting for us to see, as I said, we were cautious about the word. There were a few modest references. Then I did an article in Newsweek, and they used the headline, The Age of Globality. And then that was picked up by this organization called the World Economic Forum, which has a very high visible economic conference in Davos, Switzerland every year. And suddenly they called their conference Globality. And everybody was using it. U.S. senators were talking about globality. Germany's president said that he was there this time to talk not about globalization, but globality. And Bill Gates promised to get the word into the Microsoft dictionary, which I would be very happy about, because every time I type in my computer, it comes up with a little red line on it indicating that it's misspelled. Well, this globality is a result of three reinforcing trends. This change of mind that I talked about, the continuing integration of economies, and the force of technologies, now the internet, computers, and very important, cheap communications. And these continue apace, even as people's thinking does or doesn't change. Now, there's a lot of tests and trials ahead. One question that's very strong in my mind is, can the United States remain in this splendid isolation, be this remarkably performing, low inflation, high growth, job-creating economy amidst a generally troubled world? There's no doubt that the mismatch between the global capital markets and national financial systems remains, threatening future shocks. Remember, just a few months ago, people were ballyhooing the new architecture for a global financial system. Well, that new architecture has been downsized into some modest but valuable additions to the existing house. In Europe, there's going to be a face-off as their economies slow between the kind of euro and its open market and the instincts of the new German social democratic government. China, there are questions. And I think very much on the agenda over the next year is, will Russia continue to muddle down into chaos and reaction, or will the next Russian president restart the market process? It's as though the Yeltsin era is already over, but the post-Yeltsin era hasn't started again. And there's another very interesting question. It's a question particularly in the United States, which is, what business model will ultimately make money on the internet? Because at least so far, it appears that the most wildly successful internet business to date is actually doing the IPO, the initial public offering, as opposed to whatever you do once you've raised your money in the stock market. In other words, there are no shortage of tests and trials ahead. Many questions about how these events will play out. And what we hope as you look at the Commanding Heights, that you will find not only the context to understand and think about these issues and these changes that we see all around us, but a framework for not only seeing them, but I hope for understanding them. Thank you. So I'd be happy to have a few questions or comments.
I'm interested in your comments on Russia, and although I did not read your book, Russia 2010, I'm curious whether, since you wrote that, and today, you have modified your views, and if so, in what way, about where Russia is headed in 10 years?
Russia 2010 was an effort to apply scenarios, in a sense, tell stories about the future of Russia. We wrote it at a turbulent time, and so, in fact, when there was a lot of pessimism at that point, too, and we had one kind of more optimistic scenario of a Russian economic miracle, and in a sense, that looked like it was unfolding, but became fractured, and we've had the collapse. I went back and looked at it to see how were the scenarios working, and I saw even with the Russian economic miracle, there was, which is called Chuda in Russia, that there was a terrible economic crisis at the end of the 1990s. We wrote this in 1993, so I said we weren't completely off base. I think it's really the central question is, how do you build a market system when there hasn't been one before? And I think what the experience of Russia showed, on the one hand, it looked like it was moving much faster. It also showed how difficult it is, and in particular, how important a system of law